How far is France willing to go to reclaim its former colonies? In a shocking and almost unbelievable turn of events, France has sent military forces into Ivory Coast, aiming to seize control of the West African nation. This bold and audacious move has left the world questioning how a modern power can justify such an aggressive act in the 21st century. Is France stuck in a time, thinking it can just march into Ivory Coast like it's still running an empire? In what world does a modern nation believe sending troops to take over another country is acceptable? Let's find out. Is it possible that a massive French warship, Le Tonnerre, sailing into Ivory Coast's commercial capital, Abidjan, is truly there under the pretense of combating illegal fishing, drug trafficking, and piracy? Sounds like a noble mission, right? But is that really what's happening here? Or is there something far deeper, something that most people don't see? France's presence in Africa is nothing new. Historically, France has kept a close grip on its former colonies, always working in ways that benefit French interests under the thin cover of partnerships. Now, with one of its largest warships stationed in the Gulf of Guinea, it's clear they are not here to simply play savior to the African nations facing maritime threats. With 300 troops, 60 vehicles, and 2 helicopters on board, Le Tonnerre is on a mission that seems to secure Western interests, particularly French economic dominance, rather than focusing on the well-being of African nations. But why now? Why this show of power in the Gulf of Guinea?
Cette silhouette massive impressionne souvent.
Il est énorme.
This ship, the second largest vessel in the French Navy after the aircraft carrier Charles de Gaulle.
Vraiment un couteau suisse pour la marine française, un moyen très polyvalent.
Rentrer avec sa voiture dans le garage, sauf que la voiture fait 12 mètres de large, 30 mètres de long, 200 tonnes, et le garage, aussi bien que la voiture, bouge.
An addition.
Why, out of the blue, has France deployed one of its largest warships, Le Tonnerre, to the Gulf of Guinea? And what are they really after? Let's not mince words here. The French warship didn't just casually roll into Ivory Coast's Abidjan port because Paris suddenly developed a deep concern for illegal fishing and piracy. No, this is about much more than maritime security. France has always been strategic in maintaining its grip on Africa, and Le Tonnerre's arrival is just the latest episode in their long-standing game of influence, exploitation, and control.
Le BPC est le premier et le seul bâtiment de la Marine nationale équipé de pod.
This giant is
La surface
home.
de cet hôpital est vraiment exceptionnelle et unique sur les bâtiments de la Marine française.
To understand the real motive behind this deployment, we need to take a closer look at what the Gulf of Guinea represents. This region is not just another body of water. It is one of the most geopolitically important areas in Africa. It is rich in oil, natural gas, and a plethora of other resources that Western powers, especially France, have long coveted. The Gulf of Guinea provides a lifeline of resources that feed the industrial engines of the West, allowing European nations to thrive while African nations remain economically crippled under exploitative systems. So, when France says they're here to help with maritime threats, don't be fooled. This isn't a charitable mission. It's about protecting French economic and strategic interests. Piracy, illegal fishing, sure, those are problems. But France's primary concern is ensuring the uninterrupted flow of African resources to Western markets. The French Navy's presence in this region ensures that Africa's resources remain accessible to the West, while simultaneously limiting the influence of other global powers like China, which has been increasingly making inroads into Africa with a more balanced, mutually beneficial approach. But there's something even more telling about this deployment: the timing. Why now? What is happening beneath the surface that calls for such a bold imperial display of power? The Gulf of Guinea has long been a target of piracy, but this sudden show of military might suggest that something bigger is at play. France is sending a message, not only to African nations but to China and the rest of the world, that they are still in control. The deployment of Le Tonnerre is a bold statement, a reminder that France hasn't let go of its grip on Africa's future. It is an attempt to reassert dominance, not just over African resources, but over the geopolitical narrative that Africa is a battleground for global powers. So, is this really about Africa's security, Or is it just another form of control disguised as cooperation? When we look closely at France's colonial history, the patterns become clear. The French strategy has always been one of control through soft power, economic dependence, cultural dominance, and military intervention, all to maintain their colonial empire under a new banner of cooperation. Take, for instance, France's continued involvement in West Africa through the CFA franc, a colonial currency that still shackles 14 African nations to France's economic policy. The CFA franc ensures that African economies are forever at the mercy of France's central bank, curbing true economic independence. The arrival of Le Tonnerre is but another extension of that same old strategy, one that keeps Africa in a position of subservience. And what's at stake for Africa? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. To fully understand France's interest in the Gulf of Guinea, we need to dig deeper into the region's significance. The Gulf is not just any coastal region. It's a critical hub for global energy supplies and one of the richest areas in the world in terms of natural resources. The Gulf of Guinea is home to significant reserves of oil and gas, resources that have made countries like Nigeria, Angola, and Ghana economic powerhouses within Africa. However, despite this immense wealth, these nations remain economically vulnerable, trapped in cycles of exploitation and external manipulation. For the West, these resources are indispensable. Western economies, especially in Europe and North America, rely heavily on Africa's resources. And let's be clear, the West has no intention of losing access to these crucial commodities. France's deployment of Le Tonnerre isn't just a show of military strength, it's a strategic move to secure its own energy future. By maintaining a strong presence in the Gulf of Guinea, France ensures that its energy supplies remain stable and secure. In a world where energy competition is fierce, the West can't afford to let go of such an important lifeline, especially as China continues to rise as a global power and competitor. The Gulf of Guinea also plays a critical role in global shipping routes. The waters of the Gulf are a vital artery for the movement of goods between Africa, Europe, and North America. Any disruption to these shipping lanes, whether from piracy, illegal fishing, or political instability, could have massive economic consequences for the West. That's why France is so eager to maintain control over the region. Securing the Gulf of Guinea means securing the West's economic interests, while Africa continues to see little benefit from its own wealth. Now you must be thinking, what China has to do with all this? China is the deeper layer of this story. The Gulf of Guinea isn't just important to France and the West, it's becoming a hotbed of competition. Other global powers, particularly China, are increasingly making moves to secure their own interests in Africa. China's Belt and Road Initiative has seen massive investments in African infrastructure, offering much-needed development projects without the paternalistic political strings that Western aid often comes with. China has also steadily increased its military and economic presence on the continent, presenting itself as a genuine partner to African nations rather than their master. This rising influence of China poses a threat to the old order maintained by Western powers, and France's deployment of Le Tonnerre is as much a response to this growing competition as it is about tackling piracy. The West sees China's involvement in Africa as a challenge to its historical dominance, and France is not willing to relinquish its stronghold without a fight. By keeping military presence high in resource-rich regions like the Gulf of Guinea, France ensures that African nations are less likely to tilt fully towards China, maintaining their old alliances with the West out of necessity rather than a true partnership. But does Africa benefit from this partnership? We often hear the word partnership thrown around when Western nations talk about their military and economic engagements with Africa. But let's call it what it is. These so-called partnerships are anything but equal. In reality, they often serve as a means for the West to maintain control over Africa's resources and political landscape, while offering just enough to keep African nations on the hook. Just like this, the arrival of Le Tonnerre and its troops has been framed as a collaborative effort to enhance maritime security in the Gulf of Guinea. But who stands to gain the most from this collaboration? Is it Ivory Coast, with its modest naval capabilities, Or is it France, which needs a secure Gulf to protect its access to African oil and resources? Let's not forget that African nations have their own interests and needs. Ivory Coast, Senegal, Nigeria, and others are working to build their own naval forces and protect their own shores. They don't need France to play the role of savior. What they need is a real investment in their own capabilities, not a situation where they are constantly reliant on Western powers for military support. But that's not what's happening here. France's involvement ensures that African nations remain dependent on Western military aid and expertise, perpetuating a cycle of reliance that ultimately benefits the West more than Africa. The West has mastered the art of giving just enough to keep African nations dependent, but never enough for them to fully break free. This isn't about empowering Africa. It's about maintaining a system where African nations are kept in a position of dependence, unable to fully assert their sovereignty. And sovereignty is compromised by the military presence. The presence of Western military forces, particularly France's in Africa, doesn't just affect security, it profoundly impacts the political landscape. When a nation like Ivory Coast allows a Western power to deploy troops and warships in its territory, there are inevitable political consequences. Western nations, especially former colonial powers like France, gain significant leverage over local governments when they maintain a military presence. It's no secret that military aid and diplomatic support often come with strings attached. Let's take a look at the broader picture. France, through its military presence in Africa, has managed to maintain a substantial degree of influence over political decisions in its former colonies. Countries like Ivory Coast may receive military aid and training, but in return, they often find themselves having to align their political and economic policies with the interests of the West. This kind of leverage can lead to African leaders making decisions that benefit France more than their own people. In fact, the pattern of interference is so deeply ingrained that these nations often struggle to break free from the invisible chains of Western influence. France, much like other Western powers, ensures that African leaders are trapped in a delicate balancing act, one where defying Western interests risks political instability, economic isolation, or even military interventions disguised as peacekeeping efforts. And it's not just about France. The United States, through its Africa Command AFRICOM, has also been heavily involved in Africa under the guise of fighting terrorism and promoting stability. But let's not be naive. Western military bases and operations across the continent are less about helping African nations solve their own problems and more about ensuring that Western geopolitical and economic interests remain protected. By having a military foothold in key regions, Western nations can exert pressure on African leaders, influencing everything from trade deals to foreign policy. This is soft imperialism at its finest, exerting control without appearing to directly rule. The presence of warships like Le Tonnerre sends a clear message. The West is still calling the shots. This creates an uncomfortable dynamic where African nations may feel compelled to align with Western powers out of fear of losing military or financial support. It's a modern form of soft imperialism, where control isn't exerted through direct rule, but through economic dependency and military cooperation. It's the same playbook that's been used for centuries, just rebranded for the 21st century. Western military forces are also a constant reminder that African nations are viewed not as equals, but as regions to be managed. This diminishes the legitimacy of African leadership in the eyes of their own people. How can a government be seen as truly sovereign when foreign soldiers are stationed on their soil, supposedly protecting them from threats? The reality is that these Western forces often undermine the authority of local governments, making it harder for them to command respect and trust from their own citizens. This, in turn, fuels political instability and weakens Africa's ability to govern itself effectively. In this situation, how can Africa reclaim its sovereignty? Fortunately, the winds of change are already blowing across the continent, and Africa's path to self-reliance and sovereignty isn't just a dream. It's a reality that is slowly but surely taking shape. Across the continent, we are seeing signs of a shift in power dynamics. African nations are increasingly investing in their own military capabilities, forging alliances with non-Western powers, and taking control of their own economic futures. This is how Africa breaks free. Let's start with military independence. While countries like Ivory Coast may still rely on French military training and support, other nations are beginning to develop their own robust military forces. Take Nigeria, for example. Nigeria has invested heavily in its navy to combat piracy in the Gulf of Guinea, and its efforts are paying off. The Nigerian Navy has become increasingly capable of handling maritime security threats, reducing the need for Western intervention. This is a model that other African nations can follow, building independent security forces that can protect Africa's shores without needing foreign powers to step in. Beyond military strength, Africa is also diversifying its international partnerships. The growing presence of China in Africa is a prime example. While some criticize China's motives, there's no denying that African nations are benefiting from Chinese investments in infrastructure, technology, and industry. Unlike Western nations, which often attach political strings to their aid, China has taken a more business-like approach, focusing on mutual benefit. This gives African nations more leverage in their dealings with the West, reducing their dependency on Western powers. By diversifying their partnerships, African nations can play Western powers against one another, securing better deals and maintaining a more independent position. Moreover, the rise of African-led initiatives, such as the African Continental Free Trade Area (AFCFTA), is helping African nations assert their economic independence. By fostering trade within the continent, African nations can rely less on Western markets and more on each other. This strengthens Africa's bargaining power on the global stage, allowing African leaders to negotiate from a position of strength rather than weakness. This growing economic integration is a key step toward reducing Africa's dependency on the West. There's also a growing sense of unity among African nations when it comes to security. Initiatives like the G5 Sahel Force, which includes Burkina Faso, Chad, Mali, Mauritania, and Niger, show that African nations can come together to address their own security challenges without relying on Western military forces. By pooling their resources and expertise, African nations can build a collective security framework that reduces the need for Western intervention. This is the future of African security, an Africa where local forces, not foreign powers, take the lead in protecting the continent's interests. While the West may still hold significant influence in Africa, the tide is turning. Africa is not destined to remain under the thumb of Western powers forever. With the right strategies and alliances, African nations can reclaim their sovereignty, build their own economic futures, and establish a military presence that serves their own interests, not the interests of foreign powers. This battle for Africa's soul is far from over, but there is hope on the horizon. However, the road ahead won't be easy. Western powers are unlikely to relinquish their influence without a fight. We can already see the signs of this struggle, playing out in the form of military deployments like Le Tonnerre, where France seeks to reassert its dominance in the face of rising competition from China and a more unified Africa. The West will continue to disguise its interests under the cloak of cooperation, offering help that ultimately benefits them more than the people of Africa. But the more Africa unites and takes control of its own destiny, the harder it will be for the West to maintain its grip. This is why African leaders must remain vigilant and avoid falling into the trap of dependency. They must continue to invest in their own military and economic futures, forging alliances that serve their own interests rather than the interests of foreign powers. Most importantly, they must listen to the will of their people. The future of Africa belongs to Africans, not to the colonial powers that have exploited it for centuries. The deployment of Le Tonnerre and other Western military interventions in Africa should serve as a reminder that true sovereignty is not given, it is earned. And Africa is more than capable of earning it. From the ground up, a new Africa is emerging. One where its people, not foreign soldiers, control the future. The time for Africa to reclaim its power has come, and with each step, the continent moves closer to a future free from the shadows of imperialism. As Africa moves toward a future of self-reliance and sovereignty, the question remains: can Africa truly push the West out? The answer lies in how African leaders choose to respond to Western efforts to maintain control. For far too long, Africa has been treated as a playground for foreign powers, with little regard for the voices and needs of its own people. But the time has come to change the narrative. To push the West out, African nations must stand united in their pursuit of independence. Divided, Africa is vulnerable to exploitation. But united, the continent has the power to dictate its own terms. African leaders must prioritize the development of independent military forces, build strong economic partnerships with other non-Western nations, and refuse to accept deals that come with political strings attached. Most importantly, they must prioritize the empowerment of their own people, investing in education, infrastructure, and governance that serves the needs of African citizens rather than foreign corporations. It's also crucial for African nations to recognize that the West's attempts to maintain control will not always come in the form of overt military deployments. The West will continue to use soft power, diplomacy, economic aid, and cultural influence to keep Africa within its sphere. However, African leaders must be wise to these tactics and remain steadfast in their commitment to true independence. The question isn't whether Africa can push the West out. It's whether African leaders have the courage to make the hard choices necessary to do so. By taking a stand against foreign interference, rejecting exploitative deals, and prioritizing Africa's own development, African nations can forge a future where they are no longer beholden to the interests of Western powers. What do you think Africa's next step should be? How can African leaders effectively resist Western influence and regain full control of their resources? Let us know in the comments section. Is freedom from the West for Africa possible in the 21st century? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.